If the internet is the Wild West, then today we're strapping on our virtual cowboy boots. Yeehaw! God, that was the worst cowboy impersonation in the world.
I can tell that you're not from Western Colorado.
It does it show.
It does. Welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number. Today, we're going to take a look at some very timely legislation, the Kids Online Safety Act, or KOSA, and the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, or COPA 2.0. Both of these bills are a very natural segue from our episode last week about the FCC Project 2025, and with us today is Stephen. This week, we're talking about kids online, their privacy, data collection, what they're shown, what they're allowed to look at, what sites they're allowed to visit. It's kind of, the whole scheme of everything. And I think it's an interesting time to kind of talk about maybe the difference between when I grew up with the internet and maybe how my parents are and how you are, because I'm about 15 years older than your children. And, when I grew up, I didn't have the internet when I was really young, and then we got the internet, and we had, one desktop, we had the dial-up, we all got, 30 minutes on the computer to do whatever. As time progressed a little bit, a couple more, but my parents always made us use their computers in their office to make sure, one, that we weren't on them all the time, because again, my mom didn't even really let me watch TV or anything like that growing up. But then kind of by the time that I was allowed to be on it, I was bopping around on Club Penguin and those kinds of things. But the internet was pretty chill, I think, when I was growing up, or maybe I was just so lame I wasn't trying to get up to
Yeah,
anything.
exactly,
Sure.
exactly. Maybe you didn't try. I mean, when I was growing up, obviously we didn't have the internet, we didn't have anything. The most sophisticated bit of technology we had was like digital watches that played Yellow Rose of Texas for some reason, and we thought that was space age. But with my kids, yeah, they're online all the time. Well, they're on their phones all the time, and obviously they've got computers and things, but. I don't know why. I don't worry about it. Perhaps I should. I mean, they're on the phone all the time. I have no idea what they're getting up to, but I just don't worry about it. Maybe, I mean, they don't seem to have got into any serious trouble. I mean, or maybe they have and they just haven't told me. It's a complete mystery to what they get up to. I often do say, so, you're on your phone all the time. What are you doing? And they just say, no, I'm just looking at videos or whatever.
Right.
But, they don't seem to do an enormous amount of social media apart from within their friends groups, which I think
Yeah.
is sort of safe. So yeah, they're always,
Yeah.
WhatsApping. Actually, on Discord, sort of discording. Is that a verb?
Right.
Sort of messaging their friends and things, but they're not like engaging in sort of the more dangerous activity of sort of interacting with the wider world. I don't think.
You saying that makes me think of something very interesting where when I was on the internet, I was like on Club Penguin talking to people, or I was on AIM. And AIM is like very similar, in my opinion, to how people use Discord or even Snap now, because you're
Yeah.
just talking to people that you essentially know, your friend groups. You might be
Hmm.
having some people on there that are people that you've kind of encountered online, which is, where you can maybe get into a predator situation. But I do feel like there's maybe kind of been a roller coaster of, when I was online, we were just AIMing, talking about nothing, like little seventh graders, whatever.
Hmm.
And then maybe there was a time where people were really all over the Instagrams, all over the Facebooks, kind of getting up to weird
Hmm.
stuff, lots of problems there. And then maybe we're now back to an area where people are using it again as just kind of community building, chatting, and maybe it's a little bit safer. Because, I mean, there was definitely a time there where there was some crazy stuff happening with kids on the internet. But I also feel like maybe your kids are
But
just
is
lame
it?
like me.
Yeah, I mean, is it better? I mean, I get a feeling that we're all becoming more sophisticated online now, and finally, it's only been a few years, so we're still learning. Things are obviously changing, but I think kids as well are sort of really wising up.
Yeah,
But that doesn't mean that they're not going to get into trouble because kids always get into trouble.
of
Whatever
course.
you do, there are certain kids that are getting into trouble with it, and the internet is a big, dangerous playground for them to be engaging in. So. Um, it's difficult to know, but it's certainly true that we need guardrails and that we now
Yes.
need to start putting those guardrails in place. I think we've got a fair idea of what the internet looks like and how people use it. So now's the time to start sort of putting some barriers up, I think, which sounds terrible. I think it makes us sound very old when we say, "Oh, no, we can't let the kids have their fun." But there are some horror stories of the kind of things that happen, particularly to young girls. Girls who are bullied or forced into sort of sharing nude photos and all that kind of stuff, which is absolutely horrific. And so we need to make sure that we can stop that.
Yeah, I feel like there's kind of a time now where most people are realizing that we've kind of let technology do its thing for a while. We've understood the possible downfalls, and it's really time to make some steps forward. So, with that, let's get into these bills.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get into it. So, Sarah, when it comes to protecting kids online, is Congress finally stepping up with some real solutions, or are they just slapping a digital band-aid? I mean, we've got this Kids Online Safety Act, KOSA, and COPPA 2.0 making headlines, but are these really the answers that we've been waiting for?
Well, Stephen, they're certainly trying. And I think that's kind of the name of the game with a lot of the legislation that we've been seeing as it relates to this. Even some of the stuff that we talked about last week with the FCC and big tech, AI, there's a lot of attempts. In the words of one of my favorite coworkers, attempts are being made, but are they enough? Is kind of the biggest question here. And I think kind of a through line for a lot of people that definitely listen and tune into this is there are attempts, but they might not be all the way there. So for KOSA and COPPA in particular, they're really ambitious bills. And whether they're the ultimate fix is still heavily up for debate. And let's just say that the road to protecting kids online is always paved with good intentions. We want our kids to be safe. We want them to have great, meaningful, full lives. But there's definitely some potential downfalls.
Well, yeah, absolutely. That does sound like the beginning of a great mystery novel. Perhaps that's what this is. So let's start with the basics then. So what's the big concern? Why are kids' online activities suddenly such a hot topic in Washington?
Well, it's not so sudden, actually. The concerns about kids online have been bubbling up for years, but with social media and online platforms becoming almost inescapable, the pressure is on. And we're talking about issues like privacy invasions, exposure to harmful content, cyberbullying, you name it. Kids are more connected and more online than ever, but it also means that they are exposed to things that can make them a little bit more vulnerable more than ever as well.
Absolutely. And it's not just about privacy, though, is it? There's the whole sort of mental health aspect as well, with kids facing bullying and even predators online. So how does KOSA tackle these issues? And are we finally going to see some accountability for those tech giants?
Yeah, so KOSA, or the Kids Online Safety Act, is trying to put the responsibility squarely on the platform's shoulders. And it introduces something that's called a duty of care. That means these platforms have to act in the best interest of minors. And that means preventing things like cyberbullying or exploitation and ensuring that their algorithms don't shove harmful content in front of kids' faces. But here's the kicker. It's all pretty subjective, and what KOSA does is it actually tasks the attorney generals with deciding what is harmful content, and that obviously can vary widely depending on who you ask.
So we're giving the attorneys general the power to decide what's harmful for kids online. That does sound like it could get a bit messy, really. In different states, different people, different definitions. In Europe, in the UK, there's a slightly different approach. I mean, they're obviously very different sort of countries and groups of countries, but certainly in the UK, we have a telecoms regulator called Ofcom, and they've been given the power in our online safety bill to actually make these definitions and decide. And they're actually just right now going through a big consultation phase where they're trying to answer some of these big questions so they can actually make sure that the laws bite in the right way. And it's hugely complicated. I mean, we spent the better part of 10 years trying to design this law, and it's still not very good.
Oh my gosh, that is a long time.
That sounds like it could get a bit messy, right? So different states, different people, different definitions.
Exactly. And it's like a legal game of whack-a-mole, if you will. What's considered harmful in California might not fly in Texas, which might not fly in Rhode Island, which might not fly in Wyoming. And there's a whole issue of age verification here. In order to enforce the protections that are put forth in KOSA, the platforms need to verify users' ages, which means collecting even more data, which is kind of ironic, right? We're trying to protect kids' privacy by gathering more of their personal information.
Yes, the classic digital paradox. You need to collect more data to protect more data, which puts more data at risk. We've looked at age verification before, and we've done a few blog posts on them. And obviously, people will be aware probably that age verification for porn sites has become a big issue. Certain states have insisted on it. Various porn sites have said, well, we can't do that, not in a safe way. So therefore, they've withdrawn their services. There's a whole host of states across the United States now where you can't view Pornhub, certainly not without pretending to come from a different state. Yeah, so a thorny issue. If the government, it does certainly need to be tackled on a federal level, but exactly how they intend to do that, very tough indeed. So what about COPPA 2.0 then? It sounds like the sequel to a movie where the first one didn't really stick the landing. So what's new in this version?
Yeah, so COPPA 2.0 is definitely a reboot with a bigger budget, if you will. And the original COPPA is actually from 1998, and it's all about protecting kids online who are under 13. But let's face it, the internet back then was essentially a digital dial-up dinosaur. And COPPA 2.0 expands the protections that were put forth in COPPA to cover teenagers up to 15. Which is really crucial since teens are now some of the most active people on the internet. And it also tightens the rules on data collection, which require parental consent for kids under 13 and gives teens more control over their data. And I think there's a little piece here that I want to highlight where, at least for me, when I think about kids online, it's always kind of the fear mongering there of, oh no, they're vulnerable and people will take advantage of them. And, what are they getting up to? But there's also so much that, again, with our data that people aren't necessarily clocking all the time of the data that's being collected, how that data is being used. And COPPA really tries to understand that and protect kids from having their data farmed and sold that they aren't consenting to because, they are kids. They are still coming into who they are. And there's a very different thing from being a quote unquote adult and having your data kind of out there and around and being a 13-year-old.
Yes, absolutely. And it's something we tend to worry a lot about. It'll be interesting to see if future generations worry quite so much, where they might just accept the fact that online tech giants know everything there is to possibly know about them, and they just accept that and say, okay, well, it means I'll get better advertising or whatever. But certainly it's a question that's sort of looking for an answer, isn't it? So what we're basically doing here then is raising the age limit and then locking down the data vault. But with all these rules and new regulations and so on, are we at risk of over-regulating? Could it actually cause more harm than good, like limiting access to important resources for kids?
That's the big debate. Supporters say that these bills are necessary to protect young people in this digital world, and the digital world is outpacing current laws, which is something that we have seen time and time again in tech. But opponents argue that these stricter rules could really backfire. For example, the increased data collection and age verification could actually compromise kids' privacy more than it already kind of is with them online. And there's also concern about over-censorship. And so with this piece in particular, these bills might block access to really important content on things like mental health, sexuality, substance abuse, because they are, designated as harmful content by the Attorney General of whatever state. But kids are finding themselves, and it is good for them to be able to find community online when it comes to these types of things. Kids struggling with their sexuality, mental health, finding that community and kind of moving forward in that. But also one of the bigger things is with substance abuse, a lot of stuff online is about safe injection centers and things like that, which, obviously we would rather have people not abuse substances, but if they are going to, I want them to be safe about it. And I don't have a kid, but if that was the case for my kid, safe is better than not safe if I can't pick none at all.
Absolutely. But of course, that's a very political view, though, isn't it? So in certain states, that will absolutely fly. So I'm sure California would agree with you. But then there'll be a lot of states where they will think very, very differently indeed and say, no, absolutely. Teenagers, kids shouldn't have access to any information about sort of mental health or sexuality, in particular gender, all of those kind of things. So it does sound like a classic case of unintended consequences. So where do the bills stand right now then? Are they likely to become law? Are we looking at more gridlock?
So both COSA and COPPA have gained an immense amount of traction, both in Congress, but also just in our world. People like Kara Swisher on Pivot have talked about it. Obviously, it's in Congress. And so both of them passed through the Senate with bipartisan support just at the end of July.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, and they're now both in the House. And in the House is where things can get interesting. because there is a lot of support for these, but also the concerns really need to be addressed. Here's kind of the weirdest twist of events. A lot of big tech has actually endorsed these two bills.
Oh, well, that makes me suspicious. I mean, big tech's got a lot at stake here. So, I mean, tell me more about exactly why they think these are a good idea.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, like kind of everything we're talking about these days. But you would think that big tech would not want to be endorsing some of these policies that are outlined in these two bills because it's extra work, it's extra enforcement. When talking about the age gating for pornography sites, they just kind of decided to opt out altogether because the compliance issues and security issues were, too much.
And it costs them money as well, though, doesn't it? So their whole business model exists to funnel content to teenagers and therefore sell advertising off the back of it. They need teens to be spending more and more time online consuming their content. So surely a lot of these policies would actually mean that teens might be spending less time online and therefore they make less money.
Yeah. And, if I'm looking at it from my standpoint, I think that the tea leaves are tea leaving, and people can read that there are going to be some kind of regulations coming forward. And, companies from X to Snap to Pinterest to Google to Amazon to Netflix all have voiced their support in some way or another, if not fully endorsed this bill. Even more interesting is there was a big hearing about it where lots of CEOs from really big tech companies were testifying, and ex-CEO Linda Yaccarino said that they would continue to support COSA and create a community for teens that are seeking a voice and all of that kind of stuff. Mark Zuckerberg of Meta similarly agreed with the basic spirit of COSA, but he did not directly endorse it.
Okay, well, so that is quite surprising, really. So what should be the takeaway for our listeners for this then? Are the bills really the silver bullet for online safety? Is everything going to be fine once they're all in force, or are we just scratching the surface?
I'd say we're scratching the surface, but with a pretty big claw. The claw. But these bills are an example of a step in a right direction, essentially. And they're not the final answer. They bring crucial issues to the forefront, but like any legislation, they're going to need some fine-tuning and some serious examination. And I think it is all about who's doing that examination, who are the loudest, most informed voices in the room, and kind of where will these bills go. Again, this is something where if judgment is in the eye of the beholder, we can actually get into a much more complicated legislative mess than we're already in. And at the end of the day, not actually maybe be protecting kids as much as we wanted, but instead making all of these different types of hurdles and issues for these companies to take on. But at the end of the day, not really getting to the heart of helping people protect their kids online and the sweet spot between protecting them, but also maintaining a free and open internet.
Absolutely. And it particularly with legislation in the US, but really with legislation everywhere, the actually passing the law is only the first step, and it's a relatively small step in the process, because you then have to look at how are these laws going to be implemented, how are the courts going to interpret them, what other kind of rules and regulations will be included as part of them, and so there's a long way to go before we genuinely really know what kind of impact these laws will have. And just as we're only really finding out what kind of impact the laws in like in the UK and in the EU as well are having, even though they were passed a little while ago, they're still really figuring out how they're going to enforce and what kind of impact they're going to have. It's a delicate balance indeed then. So thanks very much for breaking it down, Sarah, and thanks to all our listeners for joining us on this deep dive into COSA and COPPA 2.0. Remember to hit subscribe, leave a review, and stay tuned for more episodes of Beyond the Bill Number. Until next time, keep questioning and stay informed.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, everyone. And I'll see you next time.